Greetings. My name is Craig Nakashian, and I'm very pleased to be presenting this paper to the Ecclesia et Violentia Conference at Kazimierz Wielki University. I'm an assistant professor of history here at Texas A&M University Texarkana, and I have a PhD in history from the University of Rochester, where I worked under Professor Richard Kuiper, and a master's degree in medieval history from the University of Durham, where I worked under Professor Michael Prestwich. My current research interests are generally the intersections of religious and military culture of the higher clergy in medieval England and France, primarily in the High Middle Ages. So today I want to talk about one of these figures, Geoffrey Plantagenet, the favored illegitimate son of Henry II of England, and how contemporaries understood his military activities and what it meant for his career. Generally speaking, bishops occupied an ambiguous position in medieval society. At once, they were members of the ecclesiastical and secular power structures, and as such, they had to balance the spiritual concerns of their diocese along with the secular concerns incumbent on major landholders and governmental officials. Bishops often experienced intense cultural pressure to serve as leading members of secular society, but simultaneously they were expected to avoid the worldliness and courtliness that could undermine their claims to spiritual purity. The issue of episcopal service in warfare was related to these arguments over courtliness and worldliness, but was also part of separate discourses on both the propriety of clerics overseeing bloodshed, as well as the importance of protecting one's flock from attack and destruction. The inherent contradictions for an office that was meant to be both in and apart from the world led to a variety of opinions as to the benefits and dangers of bishops taking on active roles in governance. Some, such as the late 6th and early 17th century Byzantine monk John Moschus, wrote reasonably humorous stories that implied that salvation was pretty much impossible for bishops to attain because of their secular entanglements, whereas others, such as Rutger, author of the Life of St. Bruno, claimed that saving souls and saving lives in the world were both important functions of the bishop. For Geoffrey Plantagenet, these competing issues were constantly in tension. Geoffrey was archdeacon and bishop-elect of Lincoln in the 1170s and early 1180s. He then became Archbishop of York in 1191, a position he held until 1212. And he owed his elevation and social position largely to the favor of his father, and his loyalty to King Henry was unquestioned. His dedication to the elder king was so marked, especially compared to Henry's legitimate children, that Henry was known to remark in jest and in frustration that Geoffrey was in fact his only true son. Geoffrey's service to Henry earned him the love and the praise of the king, and it did not stand in the way of further elevation in the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Despite resigning his election to the bishopric of Lincoln so that he would be freer to serve as royal chancellor, he was still elected and consecrated as Archbishop of York upon the death of his father and the elevation of his brother Richard. Both Geoffrey and others had parlayed their royal service into exalted ecclesiastical positions, and despite his somewhat controversial activities as archbishop, he received generally positive images from his contemporaries, with one notable exception that we'll talk about later on. Most contemporaries generally praised Geoffrey's steadfast support of the king, or treated him in much the same way as they did other secular and ecclesiastical lords and nobles. His loyalty to Henry II for contemporaries was again directly contrasted to that of his legitimate half-brothers, as well as some other high-ranking prelates. Geoffrey had gained great sympathy, for instance, when he was assaulted and imprisoned by the Chancellor William Longchamp in 1191, and he became a paragon of ecclesiastical fortitude when he willingly went into exile during the reign of King John. He was not condemned by his colleagues for being involved in military affairs, unlike, for instance, his contemporary Philip of Dreux, the Bishop of Beauvais. And Geoffrey was such a firm supporter of Henry II that he readily embraced the role of general for his father and later for his brother Richard. Geoffrey's life has been the subject of interest for observers from the 12th century right till the present. He had interest from numerous chroniclers and authors during the late 12th and early 13th centuries, but really no one dedicated more time and effort to talking about Geoffrey's career than Gerald of Wales. Gerald wrote a vita of Geoffrey as part of his Speculum Ecclesiae, the Mirror of the Church, and the other lives contained in the speculum were all of saints, or of men such as Remigius of Fécamp that Gerald was trying to get made into a saint. Gerald did not have really any overt problems with clerics who served in military roles, provided that they behaved honorably and that they fought in causes that Gerald approved of or thought worthy. Gerald therefore portrayed Geoffrey as a solid protector of his father's rights in England during the Great Rebellion of 1173. Gerald spoke of Geoffrey as fighting for his country and his father, pro patria simul et patria dimiccare. He was fighting for two licit and laudable causes: the defense of his father, as a good son ought to, and the defense of his country, as a good subject ought to. His defense of England and the rightful rule of Henry II was contrasted with the treasonous behavior of Henry the young king, Prince Richard, and the other nobles who joined them. Geoffrey's defense of the king in the face of noble rebellion was in keeping with the general tradition of ecclesiastical lords serving as royal defenders. His defense of England in the face of rapine and pillage was in keeping also with the growing popularity of the idea of the right and duty to defend the patria, as a result of increased attention and adherence to notions of Roman law. Finally, his support of his father, especially as contrasted with that of his brothers, allowed Geoffrey to tap into a basic Christian antipathy against sons who had rebelled against their fathers, as seen in the story of Absalom, for instance. Geoffrey's loyalty, when compared with the disloyalty of young Henry and Richard, was instrumental in securing this positive reputation among most of the chroniclers. Clearly, Geoffrey had done right in standing by Henry II. But what is most interesting is that his actions were judged pretty much purely on those grounds. His status as an archdeacon, even as a bishop-elect, though not as a priest yet, did not seem to matter in terms of his embrace of a military leadership role. According to Gerald, the defense of Henry II and England was a noble and correct course of action, and thus Geoffrey was noble and correct for pursuing it. Gerald certainly did not believe that Geoffrey's status as a churchman ought to have compelled him to stand apart from the Great Rebellion and let it run its course. On the contrary, he was right and laudable for taking an active role in aiding the king. This pater et patria first conception of loyalty and laudability was also found in the chronicle of his contemporary Jordan Fantom. Fantom was a troubadour and a cleric from Winchester, and he wrote a verse account of the Great Rebellion. In Jordan's account, Henry asked the Bishop of Winchester about the loyalty of various nobles who were fighting against the Scots, and then he asked specifically about Geoffrey. He said, "And the elected Bishop of Lincoln, can he not fight against these enemies?" And the bishop responded, "He is, sire, truly your cordial friend. He has enough of knights and good sergeants." Geoffrey was standing against the enemies and the invaders of England. His actions, not his ordo, were what determined the treatment he received in these contemporary writings. Following the Great Rebellion, Geoffrey continued his military service to his father, though he resigned his election to the See of Lincoln in order to do so. Pope Lucius III had ordered that Geoffrey either undergo ordination and consecration or give up the See of Lincoln, and Geoffrey acquiesced and actually abandoned the see. In his letter to the Pope, citing his desire to serve the king and to continue his military exploits as the primary reason. So clearly there is a tension here between serving as a bishop and serving as a general. But it is interesting that neither the Pope nor Geoffrey necessarily saw such service as mutually exclusive, considering that Geoffrey's military role prior to his election to the diocese. In fact, Geoffrey's election to Lincoln had been confirmed already by the Pope in the same year that he was helping to suppress the Great Rebellion. So it would seem that his very active military role did not necessarily undermine his abilities to hold higher office, as the Pope was actually attempting to engineer his consecration to that office rather than trying to find ways to nullify it. However, what is interesting is that Geoffrey and Lucius are both concerned about the ability of a man to hold a full-time military command while also serving as a full-time bishop. Indeed, we can and probably should read Geoffrey's decision to forego the office of Bishop of Lincoln as an attempt to give himself more time and flexibility to serve his king. Service to Henry II was always his primary goal, and even absentee bishops had responsibilities and duties that could interfere with their ability to be wholehearted servants of the king. Geoffrey's reticence to undergo ordination and consecration as a bishop during the life of Henry II, but his ready acceptance, to the office of York after the death of Henry II can be explained by his desire not to place any additional official commitments between himself and service to his father. Being a bishop necessarily complicated the professional soldier's life, and Geoffrey would much prefer to serve his father as a soldier rather than have to interfere in episcopal matters, as he put it. He did not think that clerics could not be active in warfare, as he himself had already been and would be later, but rather that taking the office and responsibilities of a bishop would detract from his ability to serve Henry II. During his career as chancellor for Henry, Geoffrey served his father as an important military commander in Normandy and was thus the beneficiary of positive treatment in the writings of Roger of Howden, who was a royal clerk in the service of Henry. He was entrusted with various royal castles and was in charge of coordinating large sections of the royal military apparatus. During an active rebellion, once again, by his half-brother Richard, Geoffrey was in charge of relieving the royal castles that were under siege. Gerald of Wales wrote that Geoffrey had been entrusted with almost all of the royal army to command. Richard and his Norman allies were besieging various royal fortifications, and Geoffrey's role was to bring the royal army in relief. As is noted, he brought, quote, almost the whole army, which indicates, even through the hyperbole, perhaps the importance of his military position. He also dutifully supported Henry II and came to his aid, again in direct contrast to Richard. Geoffrey was depicted as both a good son and a loyal royal commander and servant. His clerical background posed little problem for contemporaries, who judged Geoffrey according to his actions and personality rather than his ecclesiastical status. The lack of comment about Geoffrey's mixing of military business with ecclesiastical position is especially interesting in light of the fact of the legislation of the Council of Westminster in July 1175. According to that council, clerics, quote, are not allowed to give judgment on matters of life and death, wherefore we forbid them either themselves to take part in dismemberment or to order it to be done by others. This gathering also forbade those who appear to belong to the clergy from taking up arms or wearing armor. The idea of this canon, that a man could not serve both God and the secular world in military affairs, or even judicial ones, in theory applies to matters beyond being armed in military service, but its very generality demonstrates its distance from reality, since at the same time this canon is being promulgated, the Pope is confirming Geoffrey's election to the See of Lincoln. Nothing in Geoffrey's military past prevented him from gaining election, confirmation, or consecration to the See of York upon the death of Henry II. It did, however, provide useful fodder for his political opponents to contest this election, most especially Hubert Walter, who is the Dean of York, and who himself is a warrior cleric, and Hugh de Puiset, who is the Bishop of Durham. They were angered that Geoffrey had been elected by the canons of York without them being present, and thus they had been unable to cast the first votes, as they claimed was their right. They further claimed that Geoffrey's election was not canonical, that he was a murderer, and that he was born out of adultery. Despite these charges, his election was confirmed by the papal legate. In return, then, for a promise of £3,000, Richard saw his way clear to confirming this election, and he invested his half-brother with the archbishopric, after which de Puiset and Walter were reconciled to Geoffrey. Now, we can reasonably presume that this charge of murder derives from Geoffrey's military activities. As a military commander in the Royal Army, he caused, if indirectly, thousands of injuries and deaths. According to the canons prescribed at the Council of Westminster above and elsewhere, this made him at least partially complicit in the bloodshed. The fact that de Puiset and Walter were willing to use this as a cudgel against him is clear evidence of the fact that churchmen could face political costs for their activities in warfare, but that these were not insurmountable. Geoffrey's activities in war were not the cause of de Puiset and Hubert Walter's opposition, as both had used and would use similar methods themselves. Rather, it could be a standard invocation against a political opponent. That is not to say that it was a condemnable activity that was only tolerated, but rather that it was sufficiently ethically and culturally gray so it could be shaped to a variety of rhetorical needs. Regardless of the charges initially leveled against him, Geoffrey was consecrated in 1191 by William, Archbishop of Tours. He then returned to England despite his oath to Richard not to enter the country during the 3 years after Richard had left on crusade. He was forbidden to land by his successor as Royal Chancellor, William Longchamp, Bishop of Ely, and when he landed anyway, he was arrested by the Chancellor and imprisoned before being released on the orders of Prince John. This crisis precipitated the deposition and flight of William Longchamp, the Bishop of Ely. Hugh, the Bishop of Coventry, wrote a letter regarding this deposition in which he excoriated William for having imprisoned Geoffrey, and more generally for his overall lifestyle. He accused William of besieging Geoffrey in a church and then violently tearing away from its sanctuary. Geoffrey was described in perfectly normal terms. He was the wronged, humble, peaceful figure, rather than a violent, secular warrior pseudo-archbishop, as others had claimed. He was an innocent victim of Longchamp's aggression, which again is in marked contrast to other contemporary imprisoned bishops, such as the poor Bishop of Beauvais, Philip of Dreux, we talked about earlier, or Philip, the Bishop-elect of Cambrai. In a further contrast to Geoffrey, Hugh of Coventry then portrays William Longchamp as a knightly and warlike bishop so as to discredit him. After falling from favor, William had retreated to the Tower of London, clothed in a coat of mail, and then he fled to the seashore disguised as a woman. Hugh mentioned how funny it was that he was dressed as a woman, since he was, quote, accustomed much more frequently to wear the knight's armor. William's portrayal as a knightly figure was designed to exacerbate the image of him as bound up in secularity and insufficiently concerned with spiritual affairs, so as to undermine his opposition to Geoffrey Plantagenet. This is an undeniable fact of royal service, of course, and it could be seen as condemnatory, laudable, or irrelevant, depending on the political persuasion of the observer. Longchamp's position was publicly defended by Peter of Blois, the Archdeacon of Bath. In addition to defending Longchamp's character and actions in general terms, Peter also specifically answered the charges of Longchamp's perceived secularity. He described William as, quote, one beloved by God and men, a man amiable, wise, generous, kind, meek, bounteous, and liberal to the highest degree. William's generosity and liberality, of course, seen in another light, could be taken for ostentation or worldliness. William's position was also championed by Pope Celestine III. The Pope agitated for William to be reinstated, though to little effect. Celestine was a firm partisan of Richard, and thus his support of the king can certainly help to explain his support of William, but also his support of Geoffrey later on. It also helps to explain Celestine's lack of sympathy for Philip of Dreux when he's imprisoned by Richard, at least according to Roger of Howden. So we see two similar cases treated very, very differently based on the political persuasion of the papacy. In each case, the general assumption was that secularity and knightly behavior was to be criticized in clerics, even among defenders of specific clerics such as William. The actions of William or Geoffrey or Hubert Walter as royal partisans were not condemned by a large swath of clerical opinion, however. Rather, it was their demeanor and overall level of worldliness that was frowned upon, and even then usually only when it served the larger political purposes of those issuing the complaints. This was seen in the treatment of the military campaigns of 1193 that Geoffrey waged on behalf of Richard. Geoffrey was one of the fiercest partisans of his half-brother, and his enthusiasm actually caused a rift with his fellow generals. During the campaign, Geoffrey wanted to continue the offensive against all of John's castles, but Hugh and William balked, as they had been liegemen of John. Upon this, quote, the Archbishop of York left them with his people, calling them traitors to the king and to the realm. Geoffrey was in favor of bringing the royal army to the castle of Tickhill to reinforce his old foe and now ally, Hugh de Puiset, Bishop of Durham, who was in charge of prosecuting that siege. Hubert Walter, Bishop of Salisbury and Richard's justiciar, led the siege of Marlborough. Another vignette gives us the opportunity to examine how Geoffrey was viewed and how his military activities were treated, and that was his ecclesiastical conflicts with the chapter of York. The main conflict was over who had the right to appoint the Dean of York. Soon after the matter was resolved in the presence of the Pope, Geoffrey's enemies began to slander him, again according to the chronicler Roger of Howden, declaring that he was a violent spoliator of themselves and the other clergy, a dishonest extortioner, and that he had, with an armed band, broken open the doors of churches. Furthermore, he, quote, quite despised his duties as archbishop. He was devoted to hawking, hunting, and other military pursuits, and for these and for other reasons they sought to depose him. Howden certainly seems to have had more sympathy for Geoffrey than for his attackers, as is evident from his use of the terms like slander to describe their attacks, and by pointing out that they were ungrateful for the largesse that he had shown them previously, going so far as to quote Isaiah chapter 1, verse 2, I have nourished and brought up children, and they have rebelled against me. By comparing this dissension to the illegitimate rebelliousness of a son against a father, Howden was undermining the position of Geoffrey's enemies and lending credibility to Geoffrey himself. though he acknowledged that Geoffrey's arrogance did not help in the matter. Eventually, Celestine directed an inquiry into Geoffrey's behavior in 1194. He reiterated the charges from the clergy in the chapter at York, namely that Geoffrey was ignoring his ecclesiastical and episcopal duties, and instead was engaging in a life of hawking, hunting, and military pursuits. The condemnation is equal, it seems, for the lack of attention to episcopal duties as it is for the replacement activities, namely the violent military activities. In 1195, the Pope again answered complaints that Geoffrey was ignoring his episcopal duties, with his opponents claiming that he was, quote, giving the whole of his attention to hunting and hawking, and was engaged in other things which were derogatory in no slight degree to his pontifical office entrusted to him and his honor. This description of Geoffrey's behavior was ultimately accepted by the Pope, who condemned Geoffrey's life as disgraceful. Geoffrey then traveled to Rome and persuaded the Pope to forgive him. And Howden tells us that the Pope followed the advice of his whole court in absolving Geoffrey. The Pope's hardliner stance against clerical warriors was not apparently shared by all of his courtiers. Now, the only contemporary author who was overtly and pretty much uniformly hostile to Geoffrey Plantagenet was Walter Map. Map was among the most personally interesting of the 12th century writers in England. His De Nugis Curialium presented a series of anecdotal stories designed to illuminate, often sarcastically and humorously, the life that he saw around him. Map had been born in 1140, and his family had served Henry II. Walter had a complex view of the proper clerical role in terms of warfare, though in general his opinion was that warfare had no role to play in religion, or vice versa, rather. For instance, Map hated Bernard de Clairvaux, and he excoriated the Templars for their use of the sword in defense of Christ because of Christ's invocation against Peter using the sword to defend him in the Garden of Gethsemane. Walter Map hated Geoffrey Plantagenet. He hated his mother, whom he described as a harlot, who had tricked Henry II into accepting a son that was not actually his. He hated that Geoffrey was elected to the See of Lincoln. He hated that Geoffrey had exacted money from Map's own church, and he hated that Geoffrey's loyalty was to Henry II first and to God second. In all of this hatred and vitriol, however, Map never condemned nor criticized Geoffrey for being a warrior. He never complained that Geoffrey was more of a knight than a cleric. Map likely saw Geoffrey's military actions as simply a fact of his position in the world, and not necessarily as something particularly condemnable. Being active in war was a morally neutral facet of Geoffrey's life. If it had been otherwise, we can be sure that Map would have used it as a cudgel against him. As we saw with Map's complaints regarding Geoffrey Plantagenet's secularity, it was not his role as a general that annoyed him, but rather the perception that he counted Henry II as his primary lord rather than God. Being a general here was no different from being a justiciar or a chancellor or someone else in royal service. It was the prioritizing of secular service that was the primary problem, not the actual conduct in war. Men such as Geoffrey were balancing the loyalties to their king and to God and were straddling the line between acceptable devotion to both lords. For some contemporaries, and perhaps for the majority, this devotion to the king was admirable and laudable, especially in times of civil unrest and warfare, though for others they could never reconcile the image of a bishop, manfully fighting in war, with their pacific ideal of a cleric. Thank you. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them, though it will likely be during email, over email. I've provided Rodek with my email address, so feel free to contact me for further discussion. Take care and enjoy the rest of the conference.